Hi, I'm John Orquiola. I'm an editor and writer at ScreenRant's, and although my main focus is Star Trek, I'm also a lifelong fan of Indiana Jones, Star Wars, and their creator, George Lucas. And this is something I share with my two friends who I'm thrilled to talk to here today. They are the creators and hosts of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles podcast. They are Peter Holmstrom and Daniel Noah. Hi, guys.
John, it's so good to talk to you.
Thank you for doing this.
No, thank you for inviting me for this chat. Now, you guys have an exciting new project we're here to reveal today, and I think you guys should announce it.
Well, tomorrow, we plan to launch our Kickstarter for our new documentary, which is called George Lucas, The Lost Golden Age. Peter, why don't you tell them what The Lost Golden Age is?
This documentary is about what we are saying is a lost period of time in history. Many people talk about the golden eras of George Lucas, 1977, maybe 1980, maybe the Star Wars prequels for the more enlightened of the audiences out there. But there's a period of time that rarely ever gets discussed, from 1989 through 1997. A lot of people refer to this as the dark times, where everybody thinks George is just off doodling or something, but in fact it was one of the most busy times of his career, where he was really laying the groundwork for what became one of his biggest successes of the Star Wars prequels. But between 89 and 97, he was building his building blocks, so to speak, and testing out a lot of new technology, bringing to life a lot of things that now is truly the way we make movies across the board. And so this documentary is really going to be talking about this foundational period for the modern era of cinema.
Yeah, it's, when you look at the history of the films he made, The Last Crusade is in 1989. And then, the prequels start in 1999, Phantom Menace. And if you weren't, the average audience member, if you were watching movies in the 90s, you would be forgiven for thinking that George Lucas didn't do anything in between those years. And I think we're setting out to show you that there's a lot more that you don't know, and that what he was doing was important and set the course of filmmaking and the entertainment business up until the present day.
Absolutely, yeah. There is no question about George Lucas's profound influence on filmmaking, on Hollywood, on how movies are made today, 20, 30 years later, after this period that we're going to discuss in your documentary. I love the title, George Lucas, The Lost Golden Age. It sounds like an Indiana Jones title. Maybe you should actually add an and. So it's George Lucas and The Lost Golden Age.
I've tried it. When we actually had this idea for the title, and we did a number of logo studies, and there were several that had and The Lost Golden Age. And so we kind of went for the look, but totally I think the and is silent.
It's there, yeah. Your brain sees it even if it's not in the title and it's a colon. I agree. So we've been friends for a few years, guys, and I remember when you teamed up and hatched the Young Indy podcast, which has gotten very successful, but I had no idea until very recently that you were planning this documentary. So what's the origin story, and how and when did you decide to produce a documentary about George Lucas and Lucasfilm in the 1990s?
Well, there's kind of two answers there. Like maybe the easiest one is that both Daniel and I are in the film industry in different capacities, and we're always eager and looking for ways to find new projects, especially in film and TV. And so we had a lot of the skill set going into it. I've produced about 3 documentaries now. Daniel has worked in post-production and on the kind of the other side of the industry for many years, and has produced many of his own shorter documentary formats for marketing materials and things like that. So we have the skill set, and we always are looking for ways to implement that skill set regarding things we're very passionate about. But then on the other side of things too, like the podcast has been successful in ways that I don't think either of us ever dreamed of. Like, we've managed to get in touch with people that we grew up being, they were heroes of ours for us growing up. And we've managed to talk to these people, and they've been very responsive and very receptive to our podcast, because this was a period of time that no one's ever asked them about. We managed to talk to Ben Burt and Rick McCallum and so many other people who ordinarily would turn down a Star Wars podcast because they've talked about it ad nauseum over the course of their lives. But for Young Indiana Jones, they're really passionate about it, and they've never even been asked about it. So we've been both wowed and also humbled by that outpouring of support. And we thought, hey, we actually have an opportunity here to turn this into something a little more lasting, a little more permanent in the form of a documentary.
Peter's onto something there with the format. We've been making a podcast for 2 years now, 2.5 years, and only this current season, we're in our 3rd season, is it a video podcast. And already we've released, at the time of this recording, we've released 2 episodes. And the response on YouTube that we've gotten is really strong. And I think that validated our feeling that there was a whole other audience for this content in the video world. And I think the film, what drew us to the format of a film, we're interested in George Lucas, we're interested in his career. That is the driving force behind the podcast. But, if let's say you're a listener to our podcast and you're like, I want to share this with a friend, I want to share this with my online community. We now have many, 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 many hours of podcasts that you would theoretically be sharing if you want to sort of get the story. And I think what the film presents us with as an opportunity is a 90-minute to 2-hour version of that story with more context, a little bit broader, because we're not just talking about Young Indiana. But it's something that can last and be accessible to anyone, hopefully. And certainly anyone interested in the film industry or the history of the film industry or art or anything like that. And that was great. And then the idea that if we had a Kickstarter, with this network and audience that we've built, that we could fund it, because films are more expensive than podcasts. There's a reason why they're more considered more premium products. So I think that was where the idea came from. The pulling of the trigger was 4th of July. I think this is a good story. Peter took me to a director's house for 4th of July because he was invited to a director's house. And he was like, "You want to be my plus one?" I'm like, "Sure." And so we spent the day, talking to some actors that we had known of and had a fun time and talking about the podcast and the projects and where we might take it in the future. And by the end of that day, we said, let's do it now. Like, it just feels like what we're talking about and what we're discussing, it just makes sense if we do it. Like, I don't really see the advantage to like doing it later or doing a different version of it. And what's great is, we said then what would be great if we could get Rick McCallum to agree to be in the documentary, that we feel like we have a great documentary, just like if with only that piece. And, we are announcing in the Kickstarter video that Rick has agreed to do it. And we're working on the logistics and the timing and everything, but he's agreed to do it. And so that for me makes the film so exciting and so worth doing. And this is exactly the time to do it.
Totally. Now, first of all, off camera, I want to hear these stories about what happened at the director's house. We're not going to talk about it. You did mention you're creating a Kickstarter to support George Lucas' The Lost Golden Age. Tell me about that. Tell me about the perks, the tiers. What can people expect when they donate to support your documentary?
The Kickstarter we've built, and what's great is we've decided to set a fairly low goal. The idea being that there's a version of the documentary we could make for a lower amount of money than maybe we think would be ideal, but we feel strongly enough about this project that we do want to make it. We want to go full with it, and now is the time. And so our funding goal is $15,000, which for a documentary like this is low. You're not going to find a lot of 2-hour documentaries with this at that price point. But again, we know we can do a version of this at that price point. We, however, would love to do the version where we get more guests and we get to do more traveling and going to some of these places and where these people live. And I think, my personal hope is if we could get to around, $50,000, that we would have a really strong film, a really strong budget. We have certain stretch goals at that point, books and additional things we would produce if we can hit some of these benchmarks. But you asked about rewards, and I'm really excited about the reward structure we've done because we've broken it into sort of 3 tiers, I would say. And the first bunch are sort of low level, little giveaway items, branded items, bookmarks, stickers, things like that. And that's for, people who give a few dollars and so forth. And then $25 is the first tier where you can get the movie. So that's the digital copy for $25. And then we're going to have a DVD at a slightly higher tier, a Blu-ray at an even higher tier, and then what we're calling the collector's Blu-ray, which is a 2-disc Blu-ray. And that second disc will have exclusive features. Already we've shot 3 interviews for this documentary. Each interview is an hour long. So we're going to have way more material than can fit in a 2-hour documentary. And so we see that as a great opportunity to create some mini docs, as we've discussed, which would be great content for the second disc, really making that collector's Blu-ray a really great value. And certainly my favorite, if you were to ask me which tier, get that one. That's great. And then above that, we have our sort of, I call it our industry tier. This is where you're getting your executive producer credit, your co-producer credit, and these are some higher ticket rewards that are for people who are maybe serious about getting into the film business or really do want to be involved, and they would be involved. We'll have conference calls with them and regular conversations, certainly take input and give updates. So we've capped those. We're actually looking at them. We really would like only a handful of people if they do want to do that, so that we have a group that is a manageable size group that we can have meaningful communication with and actually have them be a part of the film. And some of the tiers, it's actually like, if you want, you can be interviewed in the documentary, because I'm guessing if you're going to give that much money, you probably really care about this thing. And so maybe you have some things to say, right? So hopefully you do. And if you're a quiet person and you don't want to be on camera, that's okay. You don't have to be. It's not a requirement. But we thought it could be a fun way to involve some of these producers.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It's really exciting. So when does Kickstarter officially launch?
Tomorrow.
So when you told me about this project, one of the most exciting things about it to me is that, there have been documentaries about George Lucas already. Like there's The People versus George Lucas, for instance. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Red Letter Media has done many Mr. Plinkett videos about Star Wars and Indiana Jones. But what makes those different is that they take a critical look at George and his work from the perspective of growing up with the original trilogy, which I did. You guys grew up with the prequels and loving the prequels. And obviously you guys love Young Indy, which it's something most people you haven't even seen. So I'm excited about you guys bringing your very different and unique perspective about George Lucas and Lucasfilm in the 1990s. Because, again, you guys are taking a very, very cool, very different tack based on your own fandom, your own lived experience, and what excites you about this time period in Lucasfilm and George Lucas's career, which, again, as you pointed out, is something people don't even really understand because they think George was just sitting around counting his money and waiting for Star Wars in 1997. So tell me about the story about George Lucas and Lucasfilm that you guys want to tell in this documentary.
Yeah, I think you really hit it on the head there, is that a lot of these previous documentaries that have come out, or books, film histories, whatever, they're written by people who are either contemporaries of Lucas from the era, or they're Gen Xers or maybe a little younger who grew up with the original trilogy and kind of feel like George took something away from them with the prequels. They feel a little bitter about that, and they want to express their bitterness in the documentary or a book form. And we're from a different perspective. We're from a different age group, and we're coming at it from the view that the prequels were great. They influenced our lives in very profound ways, and we can look at the entirety of George's oeuvre and say, hey, this guy really changed film history multiple times and in multiple ways, and wasn't coming at it from a capitalistic, like, oh, I have to make a more share profit or whatever out of it. His view was always, I want to create film in the way that I want to create it, and I can spread that knowledge out to the masses. And I think in many ways, this story is about a revolution in film history. It's a change in the way that movies were made on a very fundamental level that brought film to the masses, to where now here we are today, and most people who have an iPhone can make a good quality film if they want to do it. A lot of those building blocks started with George and at Lucasfilm and the work that he funded, not expecting a payout, which is something unheard of today. So in many ways, that's the umbrella for this story. In a more tactile level, the story is going to be broken up into three parts, kind of covering these three major chapters of this era. One would be Young Indiana Jones, another is the film Radioland Murders, and the third would be the Star Wars special editions. And Daniel, maybe you could talk about kind of the technical aspect of that era and why it mattered so much.
A lot of people will give George Lucas the credit of being an independent filmmaker and building his own, Xanadu in the early 80s, right? And for a lot of people, that's sort of where the victory stops. And what they don't think about is, what did he do with the kingdom once he built it, right? And what he did is, yes, develop technical tools. You can call them digital tools, although some of our guests on the podcast, it's like to call it digital, it feels like a stretch. These are sort of video-based tools, electronic tools, perhaps, that would allow you to manipulate images electronically, which to that point had just never been done. And so, you're developing sound tools, video editing tools, the ability to digitize images. We actually have a guest on the podcast in this season who we really hope to include in the documentary, who was a matte painter in ILM and invented the workflows that allowed them to do digital matte painting in the early 90s. And he actually says at one point, we called it a digitizer because we didn't have another name for it. He goes, basically a digital camera, if I were to just really think about it now. But we didn't have a language for that. We didn't have a way to say digital camera, so it never would have occurred to us to describe it that way. And so they were inventing these things. And as we look at the films and the projects that Peter mentioned, Young Indiana Jones is a digitally edited television series for broadcast, done on the Edit Droid, which is a proprietary system that they built, which uses laser discs to store footage. Because as in our interview with Rick on the podcast, he talked about how when they did eventually get to digital cinema, they had no method to store the footage. There was no storage medium high enough, and Laserdisc was an early solution for that problem, is how do you store this footage digitally? When they went to Radioland Murders, they wanted to do, there was basically the first digital filmmaking, in the sense that everything that they did on Young Indy was at a lower resolution, at a television resolution. And they wanted to know, can we do it at a film resolution? And they used a project that George Lucas had actually been planning since the 70s. It was written by the American Graffiti writers, and at one point would have been his follow-up to American Graffiti and maybe the world where he was less successful, at Universal, right? And this has been sitting on the shelf for 20 years. And actually, I don't even know the answer, and it's something I'm very much looking forward to in the process of making this documentary, of really dissecting, okay, how was this decision made? When was this script pulled off the shelf? Was Universal coming to you and asking you to do it because they figured, well, we got a movie with George Lucas that's been sitting on the shelf? Was it your idea? And then when did it occur to you to sort of make it in this new pop art style? Because my opinion of digital filmmaking, especially as it was being practiced in the 90s, as they were doing it, it's very sort of, paper mache pop art. Because today in production, we have standards. We have finishing tools. We have all these things that you have to do, like the proper way. That didn't exist in 1993. So they're sort of making this up and being like, well, if we can sort of cut this image in the computer and then paste it over here and it looks fine, then I guess that's okay. And there's something about that that's very, seat of your pants. It's very rock and roll, right? And so, Radioland Murders is this movie that's just being made in this sort of very esoteric style. And it's a period movie and trying to be a nostalgia movie, but it's being put together with these sort of, you almost can't really call them high tech tools by our standards. Now it's like a primitive version of what we have, right? But in that way, and almost all of that crew who worked on that movie go on to work on the Star Wars prequels. So there's this lineage there, and then the special edition, which I always say it gets lost in the history of the prequels because so much talk is done now about Jar Jar Binks and CGI and the prequels that, the special editions represent some tremendous breakthroughs in the history of filmmaking. Again, we spoke to Yusei, our guest, who talks about the shot when the land speeder pulls into Mos Eisley. It's now this kind of a pullback shot. And he's like, yeah, we invented the technique that allowed you to do that. It's a matte painting, which I painted, projected onto 3D architecture, and it had never been done. And he walked us through the conversation he had with the programmers of like, well, could you do this? And could you, well, yeah, we could do that. Well, then I could do this part. And he's traditionally painting because he told us there were no digital tools that you could paint digitally, because I had to paint the old way. And then we would scan it into the computer and put this all together. And again, that's the craft in that. And the fact that that's the invention of it in this version of the movie that, frankly, you're not going to find another documentary. It's not going to crap all over the Star Wars Special Edition. I mean, good luck. You're not going to find one, right? And I feel so bad for those artists, for Yusei, who, probably doesn't get to talk about it much. And he broke barriers, and he broke through technological barriers and sort of changed an art form. And no one wants to talk about it. So, these three pieces, I think, are very important. And again, Phantom Menace hadn't come out and made $1 billion yet. This is a period when George is taking chances, he's experimenting, he's pushing out these boundaries with no real guarantee of return, right? And the special editions did make a decent amount of money for re-releases at the time. But even so, there was a lot of risk here. And if at the end of this, let's say the prequels had failed commercially, I mean, he's probably done. I mean, he put everything into this project of building an art form and a way of making film and television that was so successful, it just became the standard and no one wants to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, and now I feel is the right time for this documentary. The Phantom Menace did very, very well theatrically released. Revenge of the Sith did even better. The prequels have been reassessed by a whole new generation, and they now take a different place in how the overall structure of Star Wars is remembered. And now they influence so much of Star Wars now that's being made. All of that is based off of the success of the prequels. So absolutely, I think you got to tapping into something that is going to be very much on the zeitgeist of how Lucasfilm, George Lucas's career is going to be reassessed, especially with the museum opening up in Los Angeles next year. So I'm really excited about this. But I also want to ask you about Rick McCallum. He sat down and talked to you guys for Young Indy podcast, and you guys got a great boost when he talked about Star Wars Underworld. So I was really, really proud of you guys for that. When you have Rick back for this all-new interview, what can you tell us about your plans for Rick this time around?
Well, Rick always asks for questions in advance, and then we talk to him, and we end up just talking about whatever. So we can't really predict how that conversation is going to go. That said, I think it's an opportunity. We did talk about Star Wars Underworld with Rick, but we really didn't talk about Star Wars much else. Mm-hmm. And we are, of course, going to talk about Young Indy, but I think because it's a 2-hour film, it's going to be a bit broader than the granular approach that we take on the podcast. We spent 3 hours with Rick, and we covered a lot of ground, and it's excellent. I recommend people go listen to it if they haven't. But when you're talking about a film, I think the story of the period and the story of George, which is what we're really trying to tell, and what George was wanting to do and trying to do, and what he asked Rick to help him do, and their partnership, because everything George does basically post 1991 until he retires from, Star Wars and Lucasfilm is with Rick McCallum. He's his right-hand guy. And that perspective and that bond, again, I think, I'm just going to say it, the Gen X crowd that hates the prequels so much, because they hate the prequels, they downplay the importance of Rick McCallum in the story of George Lucas. But he's actually George Lucas's longest single collaborator in his entire career, right? And they have a great relationship, a trust. And, it's interesting because we've interviewed so many people who've worked with Rick. And he, by all accounts, and certainly in our experience, is a personable, affable guy, a charming guy. And it's great to see that George sort of chose someone like that to essentially be his representative, to go out and negotiate and do all these things and get this thing going. And it's kind of like, everyone always makes fun of George for being quiet or whatever. And it's like, he's basically like, okay, I'm quiet. I'm going to get a gregarious guy. But no one wants to give him the credit. Nobody ever wants to give George the credit when he actually does something, when he's like, oh yeah, okay, I'm going to do this. So it was my 2 cents. So
you have this Kickstarter, and as you mentioned, you believe you could do this for the base level amount that you have. But let's say you guys break that barrier, you break your stretch goals. How big is your vision for this documentary if you could achieve that kind of support?
Yeah, the hope is that we're able to. Young Indiana Jones, in particular, was an international production. They filmed all over the world in over 20 countries, I believe. Our hope is with this documentary is we'd be able to mirror that a little bit. We'd be able to go on location to film interviews with people that worked on the show. They hired some of the top tier directors in their respective countries, whether Australia or Europe or Great Britain, and we'd love to go and interview these people in person to get their sides of the story. I think oftentimes the story of Star Wars is rather landlocked to America. And in fact, though, Young Indy in particular had such an international presence, and we would love to represent that by going to these places. We're hoping to get Rick here in America, but he's based out of Europe, and it could be that we're going to need to fly there to interview him in person. And we're more than willing to do that. But of course, travel costs money. So it would be great to be able to afford these things and be able to really broaden out the scope quite a bit. A lot of the locations that they filmed Young Indy at are still very similar, and we'd love to be able to go there and try to represent the grandeur that the show had from the period.
I think there's also, we have a little list, or a mental list, I suppose, of people we want to talk to for the documentary, and I sort of think of it as at budget levels. Like Rick is essential. We'll go to Rick if we raise $15,000 and it takes all 15 to go to Rick. We would spend that. We would do that. Ben Burt, who's also agreed to sit for the documentary, is essential, right? And we'll get Ben. We'll we drive up to San Francisco and we'll rent a Motel 6 if we have to, whatever, right? But, one of my favorite interviews in the podcast was with Simon Windsor, who lives in Australia. There's just no world where we can go to Simon Windsor in Australia without tremendous financial backing, right? And there were a couple of directors from Australia. So, and if we were able to do this, we would try to batch these groups of people that are in these places. The UK, so many of the people that we speak to on the podcast even live in the UK, right? And so, okay, we want to go interview them. Well, what if we can't get them all in the space of 2 days? What if they're available over the course of 2 weeks, and now we need to be able to be in the UK for 2 weeks? And so, obviously, if we don't have the funds, then that's just off the table. And then it becomes a question of, okay, who can we get? We have to choose. We have to say, all right, we can be there for 3 days. And so we can get these two people because that's who's available in the 3 days. So the vision for the documentary, it's like, okay, if we can raise, I don't want to put a number on it, but if we can exceed our greatest hopes, now we have the flexibility to say, okay, you individual, we want you in the documentary and we can do whatever it takes to accommodate your needs and schedule because we have this flexibility because of our backers and how they've supported us. And so that's the dream, right? It's not the sort of documentary, thankfully, where, we have to buy a lot of items or there's something like that where it's like, well, if we get this money, we can get a soundstage. We don't need a soundstage, right? But we do need, potentially places to film in, especially if we're traveling overseas, whether it's a peer space or an Airbnb or something. We do need certain kinds of equipment. And if we're traveling, you may not be able to bring equipment with you. It can be difficult to travel with equipment. So maybe you need to be able to rent equipment in the foreign country in which you are traveling to. So these are the considerations that a documentary has when you're talking about cost. Help, we might need to hire someone in a location that we're in, to whether it's to do lighting, to drive. Maybe an interviewee is able to come, but they many of these people are advanced in age. Maybe they would need assistance getting to the location in some way, and so we might need to hire a driver. We might need to hire, so these are the sort of costs that could come up. Lodging, perhaps, if it's like, let's say we go to the UK and someone's like, well, we can all get to you in London, but you put us up overnight in a hotel, right? It would be great to be able to say, yeah, absolutely, we can do that. Yes, you come here, take care of your lodging. We'll take care of you, right, for this period of time. So those are the things that would be great to be able to offer that just realistically we're not going to be able to do at the lowest level of the funding that we're hoping for. It doesn't mean we can't make a movie. Doesn't mean we can't interview some great people, right, and tell a compelling story. But if we want to tell the full story, right, with more points of view, that's where greater support comes in.
Gotcha. Do you have a rough idea of production to release? Do you have a date or a goal in mind for when you would like to actually have this completed?
Well, there's an obvious hope, I think, if you're a fan of these things. There's a great anniversary coming up, and it would be wonderful to have the whole thing, packaged and ready for, with a distributor or something, by the 50th anniversary of Star Wars in 2027, right? So I think that's our greatest hope. And as we build out the Kickstarter, a lot of our deliverables are in that time period, because that's when we hope. We think that would be a great time to have this documentary finished and out. So far things are very smooth, and we hope that the Kickstarter launches and is very smooth, and we can produce this quickly. But you want to allow for time. You want to allow for someone not being available for a while. Maybe they're working on a film. We've had so many guests for the podcast who are like, well, I'm working on a film for the next 3 months, but after that, I can speak to you. So, that might happen with some of the people that we'd really love to get. And you want to be able to wait for those people, certainly if they're an important story. So you have to be open to those shifting times.
Awesome. All right. Well, I have one last question for you guys, and I've actually wanted to ask you guys this question pretty much since you guys started the Young Indy podcast or whatever it was, two and a half years ago, which is, why do you love Young Indy so much?
For me, there's so many factors involved with it. I love the big scope of the show. It exceeds a lot of the, it's so much bigger than a lot of TV shows that were on at the time. There's a tantalizing element to it too. It's this kind of forgotten, hidden treasure that's out there. It's, diehard fans of Indiana Jones might be vaguely familiar with Young Indy, but it's been hard to find. There's a good DVD out there, but it's out of print, so it's kind of this lost aspect to it. But also, as you get into it more, it deals with a lot of really interesting themes that are still very present today. In many ways, a lot has been talked about George's own philosophy that gets distilled and spread out in the Star Wars prequels. But in many ways, we've come to think of Young Indiana Jones as kind of the purest version of George's philosophy on life and on humanity. I mean, he's never come out and tried to form a religion out of it, but a lot of the stuff he talks about has a very existential nature to it. And he has a philosophy of like, what is the best way to live as a person? And Young Indy really digs into that on a very deep level surrounding the conflict during World War I. And it's just an internally fascinating technique that he takes too, both in Young Indy, but also in the Star Wars prequels, of like saying, I have a end result of a character, being Indiana Jones or Darth Vader, and how does a person add up to that? What is the building blocks that add up to that person that we meet in Raiders and in the original Star Wars film? And I think it's just such a fascinating approach. You can see so many other prequels that are put out there on TV or in movies where the creatives mostly just say, well, the character's basically just the same, but just younger and maybe a bit more in shape or something. But George really took the approach of saying, no, there's people aren't born one way. And I think that's really true. No one's born good. No one's born evil. We develop this way over the course of our lives because of a billion different moments and different interactions. And George tries to distill that into key moments in Young Indiana Jones and again, to a degree, in the Star Wars prequels, and there are 3 films. But and I just find that eternally fascinating. I think it's such a great approach, and yeah, I'll leave it there.
I find George's view of the world to be incredibly exciting. So, and I think Young Indy is a great example of what that looks like. There's a style to the way he stages action, the way he stages things. It's definitely not modern. You never see a bunch of guys in anything Lucas deploying in some sort of tactical fashion, right? It's very reminiscent of something you might have seen in the early 1950s in a film, with a bunch of pirates jumping off of a ship and attacking something. Like, that's basically a George Lucas action scene in anything he's done. I don't care what it is. And Young Indy has a lot of that. What Young Indy does, though, it's actually George's most mature work, I think, because he's trying to season his usual high adventure sort of sensibilities, his matinee sensibilities, with a little philosophy, with a little morality, religion, in a much more literal way than he does in Star Wars. And one of our theses on the podcast is like, well, the audience didn't really take to it. Like, the audience really wasn't interested in that literal of a lesson. And so he goes back to Star Wars, and he actually makes the prequels a little more, a little less serious, I should say, or a little less didactic than maybe, I don't know what his conception was, but there is a world where you could make the prequels as didactic as Young Indy. You could have the characters speak about serious philosophical issues that way, and he chooses not to do that. And sure enough, they made a lot of money at the box office. So I think he's very attuned to the audience in general, and he feels an obligation to the audience. And Young Indy is him letting himself off the leash a little bit, because the economics of television don't tie him to a box office. And so the show was a commercial failure, but it didn't really touch him. He didn't really lose out because he had his deal from ABC, he had his deal from Family Channel, right? And they were able to make these very inexpensively. As a filmmaker, the technique on display and the fact that they sort of made these series of films, for relatively little money. I mean, the cost of a major motion picture today, basically, for the entire thing, is inspiring. And, I put on a Young Indy, whether it's Phantom Train of Doom or Treasure of the Peacock's Eye or whatever, and he shows up on screen because something's going on, because something always is, and I get that little rush of excitement. It's the character of Indiana Jones. The first Young Indy I saw in its entirety was Treasure of the Peacock's Eye, and that movie opens, and it was aired as a TV movie, in a trench in World War I. You have no idea what's going on. You realize that Indy and his friend are running through the trenches looking for someone, and it turns out they're there to arrest a spy, and the other guy's like, the war's going to end. The treaty's already been signed, and they're like, we don't care. And they end up chasing this guy through no man's land as the war's about to end. I thought that was awesome. I was like, this is cool. And if you like a lot of people have watched the Clone Wars. If you like the Clone Wars, the storytelling style is very similar. The Clone Wars is not quite as educational, shall we say. but the nature of the action, the way the characters are, the way that the relationship between the characters and World War I is sort of very similar to the characters in the Clone Wars with the war itself. It's the nature of the conflict and the sort of missions that they go on. It's an essential part of Lucas's body of work. And I think if you want to understand the guy as a filmmaker, you got to watch it. I mean, that to me, I would say anyone criticize him. I don't care if you like the work, but if you want to understand the work, you got to watch it. It's required.
Awesome. Daniel, Peter, we're very, very excited for you guys. I'm very excited for this documentary, George Lucas, The Lost Golden Age. I hope everybody checks out the Kickstarter. I hope everybody comes and supports it. I hope you guys get to make the vision of this documentary beyond your wildest dreams. I can't wait to see it. I'm going to support you guys. And thanks for talking to me today.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. Thanks for doing this.
You're welcome.
We are the Young Indy Chroniclers, the hosts of the only podcast exclusively covering George Lucas's forgotten masterpiece, the Young Indiana Jones television show.
We're now bringing this experience to an all-new documentary, George Lucas, The Lost Golden Age.
The untold story of how he laid the path to his own creative freedom.
Those 4 years in there was the happiest period for Lucasfilm.
So he appeared on the set as the second unit cameraman with his arm in a sling. I mean, it's typical of George. He does not give up.
George Lucas coming at it from a completely unique angle, and he was going to do this Lawrence of Arabia scale epic on a 16 millimeter budget.
George made it clear he was doing something special, that he had high ambitions for the series from the beginning.
The thinking man gives every life the same reverence that he gives his own.
He didn't need to be doing television. I mean, he had two of the world's great movie franchises at his fingertips.
This period saw Lucas primarily focus on three equally challenging projects: the Young Indiana Jones television show, the film Radioland Murders, and the Star Wars special editions.
This was a test bed and a proving ground for some of the earliest digital filmmaking technologies that are now being used, from the smallest YouTube creators to the biggest studio multi-billion-dollar productions.
You didn't think I was going to run, did you?
I think some critics and film people were objected. The audiences were okay with it.
We're thrilled to report that Rick McCallum, the producer of the Star Wars special editions and the prequel trilogy and the Young Indiana Jones series and Radioland Murders, has agreed to sit with us for an all-new exclusive interview just for this documentary.
And the publicity after American Graffiti and again after Star Wars, George Lucas's next project is going to be Radioland Murders. Again, what is that?
We're also in contact with other key figures from the period, including Ben Burt, Jonathan Hales, and many others who played an enormous part in bringing this era to life.
You really couldn't do that show traditionally the way he was thinking of it. And of course, he found ways to do it that were not traditional.
And we want you to come along with us. We've built this Kickstarter campaign to support the film and help us cover costs, such as travel, equipment, post-production, and final deliverables. While we do believe there is a version of this documentary we can produce at our lowest funding goal, there are many things we would like to do for this film that would require higher funding. The more money we can raise, the better this documentary will be.
We've set up multiple tiers of support with some amazing perks that you can become part of the process. Whether it's a $5 thank you tier, or if you want to cement your name in film history right next to George Lucas, there's something for you.
You can't do anything by yourself. You have to have people you can do it with.
We hope you will both support us financially and also share the word about this campaign to everyone who wants to know the true story of George Lucas, The Lost Golden Age.